I'm Jean Gray, publisher of American Entrepreneurship Today and host of the podcast series Experience Voices, where I talk with highly accomplished people who share the critical elements that led to their success. Our topic today on Experience Voices is how to fund a MedTech startup, with guest Patrik Schmidle, founder and CEO of CARI Health, that's developing the world's first wearable medication monitor. Patrik shares how CARI Health's progress was achieved through timely funding from an investment awarded as winner of the San Diego Angel Conference, which led to a substantial raise from individual angel investors and angel investor groups. CARI was also awarded multiple grants from the National Institute on Drug Abuse and National Science Foundation that supported product development and human clinical trials. More recently, the startup received investments from Cedars-Sinai Accelerator and the Rady Venture Fund. Patrik, thank you for being a guest on Experience Voices.
Well, thank you for having me. I'm looking forward to it.
Well, I'm very much interested in hearing how you navigated through all your funding challenges with your MedTech startup. So maybe we'll start with explaining to the listeners a bit about your product and how it was developed and how you became involved in starting the company.
Sure. So our product is a remote medication monitor, and it's about the size of a quarter. It has tiny little microneedles on the bottom that are pain-free, that are coated with an electrochemical assay, and those are used to detect medication levels in the interstitial fluid in real time. And essentially for two purposes: one, to inform personalized dosing, and two, to monitor medication adherence. Conceptually, you can think about it as similar to continuous glucose monitoring, but instead of monitoring glucose levels, we're monitoring medication levels.
When did you start the company?
So in its current iteration, it was in October of 2021 is when we officially formed our C Corp with our current focus on a wearable medication monitor. Originally, when we started the original concept, that was way back in 2015, but we had a completely different idea, focus, same sort of target market, if you will. It's become more narrow and focused over time, but that's when we originally started the concept, and I had an original co-founder that we started the business with.
So how does a pivot like that occur? I don't know if you want to go into too much of the gory details, but I wouldn't say I have heard that very often a startup pivots after the first year or two once they've learned more about the market. So is that the case where you went along with your idea, your intellectual property, but it ended up bringing you to a different place?
Yeah, I would say that learning about the market was definitely one aspect of it, and we had a couple different pivots. And I don't think we want to go into the gory details because it'll take up the entire podcast. Okay. But certainly, one core theme about being part of CARI Health is to really listen to your customer. And certainly, when your customer tells you that your solution is not the right solution for the problem that you're trying to solve, then you have to listen. You have to pivot, and that, in a nutshell, we've learned that, and we learned to listen. And certainly, since 2021. Rather than having a solution looking for a problem, we really have a solution that is solving a real problem.
Yeah, that's great advice. That's something that I picked up early on. I had two prior companies in which listening to the customer and being open to changing your original thesis about why you're starting the company. So I'd just explore more about how, when you do start the company, and it is a MedTech and it has a certain life cycle of its own because of the technology, walking through someone who was in that space as to how you navigate the funding and the horizons that come up, because it's sort of a little bit like project management, is you're trying to lay out milestones and goals, but it's really the funding that allows you to progress. So at the very beginning, when you did narrow it down to the current product, what was the funding in place? Was it yourself, or you immediately knew you could go after something like an SBIR grant?
So that's really how we got into the MedTech space, is through grant funding. And originally it was through the National Science Foundation. That was our original phase 1 SBIR grant. And that then evolved into a phase 2. So in total, we received about $1 million in SBIR funding from the NSF. And then essentially we build relationships with folks at the NIH, specifically in the National Institute of Drug Abuse. And they asked us to see if our technology could be used to address the opioid crisis. And so we were able to also receive a phase 1 from the NIH, and then that was followed by a larger grant, a $3 million grant that was under the HEAL umbrella, HEAL. And that really was a catalyst for us to double down on our development of the MedTech device, and enabled us to hire some folks and build out our team. But at the time, we were still working on an implantable sensor. We then, circling back to your original question, we came for a number of reasons to the conclusion that an implantable sensor was not going to work, either from a technical perspective or customer adoption was always going to be an issue on that front. So that was when we pivoted in 2021, late 2021, towards a wearable instead of an implantable monitor, and specifically away from trying to detect illicit substances towards monitoring medication levels. And so that was what got us towards the current situation, or the current focus. And we're very grateful because our program directors at both the NSF and the NIH supported our pivot, and we were able to use the remaining funding under those grants to move into this direction.
Where does the product stand today? Has it been in trials or is it out in the market?
We're just getting ready to do first-in-human studies. We just received IRB approval. We received the non-significant risk device designation, which is in the medical device world a critical milestone. And now we're getting our monitor and our sensor ready to first-in-human studies.
So going back to the funding part of it, so you definitely benefited from grants, which I think most people going into MedTech understand how important getting that grant money is. And then you also mentioned that you were able to bring on the key personnel to do the development work. So I also know you were very successful at the San Diego Angel Conference in getting an award from them. Tell us a little bit about that.
Yes, so that was at the beginning of our efforts to raise private funding. So for a number of years, we were using grant funding to try and advance the science and the technology to the point where it was no longer a science project, but where it could be converted into a commercial product, if you will. And back in the beginning of 2022 is when we said, okay, well, we still have quite a bit of runway left with regards to our grant funding, but let's raise some private funding to jumpstart our efforts and double down on our efforts. And so we participated in the San Diego Angel Conference. That started, I think we applied, it was December of 21, and then the first sort of pitch session started in March, I believe. And so it lasted, I think, through April or May, if I recall correctly. By the time the sort of the finale occurred, and we were able to receive that award from the San Diego Angels Conference. And that really was the catalyst for us to be able to raise a seed round from a number of angel funds. And so that's the funding that we're operating under right now.
How much was the award at the SDAC conference?
So just SDAC was $350,000, but then we were able to syndicate that deal, meaning we were able to take the terms that under which SDAC awarded us the $350,000 award, and then also go to funds like New Fund and Cove Fund and Medical Device of Tomorrow and Chemical Angels. And essentially, they also invested on top of the San Diego Angels Fund to get us to close our seed round. In addition, there was a $500,000 PD that was a combination of SDAC and New Fund investors that were basically sidecar investments, where they were, for the most part, investments that were below the $100,000 minimum that was required to get on our cap table.
How did you take that step after winning the award at SDAC to identify the angel groups? Were there contacts made at the conference, or just by winning the award, doors were open that if you had gone directly might not have been open to you?
Thinking back, we had already been talking to a number of angel funds, and typically the way that it worked was there were introductions made. So through my network and the network of the company to folks that were running or were part of these angel funds. So we've already been in dialogue with a number of them. And the feedback at the time was, well, we really love what you're doing, but come back when you have a lead. and so, which is something that many startups hear, right? Is that essentially funds or individual angels, they may not necessarily feel like they have the expertise to do the due diligence on a deal like this, and so they defer to somebody that does have the expertise. And then once somebody like a San Diego Angels conference does the due diligence, they look at all aspects of the business and basically write up a due diligence report that everybody can take a look at, then it becomes much easier. They already agreed to the terms of the deal, and essentially, they said, okay, yeah, for where the company is and what the potential is for the company, we agree that this is the right valuation, and we agreed to the terms, and then everybody else can say, okay, we'll either participate in this deal or we don't for whatever reason.
And so I noticed that there were a number of angel groups participating. So is it that lead then goes out and reaches out to their connections at the other angel groups that are in the MedTech space?
It's different in every case, right? So some funds are part of what's called the ACA, or the Angel Capital Association. And so there are a number of angel funds that are part of that. And there are also certain funds that are part of either the GUST platform, or there's another platform, can't remember the name right now, but essentially those are platforms where if there's a deal in place, other angel funds will become aware of that deal and then they can participate. In our case, there was some crossover between angel investors that are part of San Diego Angels and that are part of New Fund. And so basically that was sort of a natural next step, right, is for us to go to New Fund. And then once both New Fund and San Diego Angels invested, all of a sudden, we had more than $500,000 of funding. And then we had some individual angels that had already agreed to participate that wrote sizable checks. And so basically the San Diego Angels Conference was a catalyst for us to get to $1 million in funding pretty quickly, right? And that's sort of critical mass, right? Where then all of a sudden others started to take us seriously, because there were, we had $1 million of investments, multiple investors had invested, and then they all agreed to those terms, and so then it was theoretically easier to to get everybody else on board and close out the round, But then what transpired as we got towards the latter part of 2022 was that the macroeconomic environment really changed, and so rather than it becoming easier and easier to close out the round, it became almost by the day more difficult and more difficult.
So when you bring on the private money, do expectations change, or how are you now communicating to these groups who previously, you did not have involved and you were just under the grant money?
Well, sure. You feel as a company, you feel a great sense of obligation to generate a positive return on the fund's investment and individual angels' investment. So certainly, while there's also an obligation that you have to funding agencies, the level of scrutiny and the level of pressure definitely increases. There's no question about it. So, one example that I sometimes share is that when we went through the Silicon Valley Bank crisis, essentially, we were one of the customers of Silicon Valley Bank, and over that weekend, all investors were worried about their portfolio companies, right? And so I think I sent out 6 emails to all of our investors over the course of that weekend, from Friday morning to Monday or Tuesday when the situation was resolved, to give them an update on where things stood with us, right? And so you definitely want to make sure that you over-communicate, you're transparent about challenges that you're facing, and not just report on the progress, but also, hey, here's some of the things that we're working through. And because, investors, especially experienced investors, they know that it always takes longer than you think. It always costs more than you think. That the key is that there has to be good communication about the challenges that you're facing and what you're doing about them.
Now, being a MedTech startup, your investors know the lay of the land. They have long-term expectations. They're early in, so they're savvy now to know that you are looking for an exit in some form of acquisition or IPO. So what's the time horizon that they have this comfort level about?
Well, sure. Anybody that invests in MedTech, especially at the seed stage, understands that it takes time, and certainly the horizon typically is in sort of the 3 to 5 year range. But many know that specifically with MedTech devices, it sometimes takes longer, right? And the way that we've always communicated with our investors is that, look, there are certain inflection points that we're managing to. Each one of those inflection points, the valuation of the company will increase, and we'll have opportunities at each one of those inflection points, and then we'll make decisions around whether or not an acquisition is right at that time, or whether we're going to wait until the next inflection point. And clearly, the further you think about the 4 inflection points, the further we get to on those to the 4th inflection point, the more compelling the return is going to be, right? But sometimes you make a decision in the interest of the shareholders to sell earlier, and the valuation might not be quite as high as what you'd like it to be, but sometimes those things are out of your hands.
It's very milestone driven then. So you've put in your pitch where you anticipate the progress to be made, and that would possibly trigger need for additional funds. So if you're adhering to the schedule that you gave them, it really keeps their anxiety levels down, their optimism up about having made the investment, would you say?
I think that's part of it, and certainly the other part of it is what are you doing to extend your runway, right? And so one of the things that we've done is we also apply, in addition to opening up another funding round from private investors, we also submitted several SBIR applications, and we just recently won another award. So certainly existing investors appreciate that because it's non-dilutive capital, so it doesn't dilute them, and it also makes sure that the company has funding for several years to come.
With a number of angel groups behind you, are there any individual investors that emerge that become more in an advisory role, or is there distance where it's just the money at this point and you don't really need to bring on any particular individual other than your team?
Well, I mean, one individual investor, actually the largest individual investor, he's actually on our board of directors now. And so Charles Patton, he's on our board of directors, and we meet very frequently, so he's become a key advisor. And then we have 2 board observers that represent several of the angel funds that have invested. So they don't have voting rights, but certainly they participate in all the board meetings, and one of them is Keith Richter. He's also an individual investor, and he was the deal lead for both New Fund and San Diego Angels. And so he's very close to the business, and we benefit from his advice as well. And then Damota Reddy, he represents the Cove Fund and Chemical Angels Fund as an observer, and he's had multiple startups that he's been part of, so he has a great deal of experience. So we definitely benefit from their guidance and their advice on a frequent basis.
So it definitely seems that when you get the angel groups involved, they are also a pathway to further connections and opportunities in the funding space.
There's no question about it. And it's been, all the funds that we're working with have been great with regards to facilitating connections, opening up opportunities to participate in conferences, presenting various occasions to help continue to promote the company and get us in front of, just to get us in front of more people, because it's all about making sure that our brand and our company is in the forefront, and people are thinking about it as they know what we're doing and are getting excited about what we're doing, so that they can eventually join the effort in some way, shape, or form.
So stepping back a little bit, is that you have this great team around you, and I know from your background that you've been involved as an entrepreneur for a number of years. So what is the skill, or what is the circumstance in which an entrepreneur is able to find the talent timely for what they're for what they're doing? Because people get to a certain point, it's entrepreneur is singular, and then it becomes a we, but you don't necessarily have that talent at your fingertips, or do you?
I think it's a combination of constantly looking for people and talent and resources to help advance the progress of the company, and trying to identify the right talent and the right cultural fit, and constantly being on the lookout for that, and also using and utilizing your network to get introductions proactively. And then trying to find out, are there, when you talk to people, really listen to where they are with regards to their career, and is there a certain passion that comes when they start talking about what we're trying to do? Is it more than just a job for them, right? Are they willing to contribute sometimes voluntarily without getting paid? Are they willing to collaborate with us on a grant proposal that potentially can get them to be part of the company, right? And so we've done that with a number of folks where we started collaborating on a grant proposal, and then we wrote a role for them into the grant. For example, our chief scientific officer, that's how he joined the company. With others, they were consulting roles that we carved out, and it was on a limited time frame, if you will. And it turns out that, hey, they're a good fit. Their experience makes a lot of sense for us. And then if and when we have funding to then make that happen, to bring them on board full time, then we will do so. But we've been very cognizant of keeping the team small and the core team very small, but working with consultants and partners to advance our progress.
So I think it would be some very good insight in that period of time when you're building your team and you're still working through your funding, and you still have a number of years before you're going to really hit, pay dirt, so to say. Can you give a little bit of insight about maybe the nuance of bringing someone on board, and are there legal documents that have to be put into place that formalize a lot of the discussions of, hey, right now you're just helping me out or helping us out and you're consulting, and then there's a flip over to, we need you to be part of the team, but they're looking for a piece of equity. Just a kind of little bit of the weeds there because I think a lot of first-time entrepreneurs have this anxiety of, how do I negotiate with someone of great talent, and the person with the talent is smart enough to know they've got a negotiation going on here.
Yeah. I call it sort of a constant process of alignment, right? You have to align the goals and objectives of the company with the goals and objectives of the people that are thinking about joining your team and that you're thinking about bringing on. And there has to be enough alignment on both sides to make it work. And certainly it's a combination of the type of work it is, the compensation, the equity, and it's getting the right balance at the right time to make that work. And it's definitely not, I don't think there's a magic formula to it. The key is to make sure that you're transparent with the people that you're talking to, and sometimes they have to trust you because the legal paperwork is not necessarily in place, right? And you don't want to spend the money to necessarily
right.
put it in place. But the key is that you're whatever you're promised that you have to deliver on, because otherwise, if you're making empty promises, then you lose the trust, right? Not just of the people that are thinking about joining, but then your team is probably going to hear about it as well, and they're going to think, well, if you're not delivering on what you're promising somebody that is thinking about joining the team, can I trust you that you're going to deliver on what you're telling me? and so it's just really important that you're transparent and straightforward, and it just the level of communication, the frequency, and the number of people that you're communicating with increases at every stage, right? So you're constantly communicating and aligning.
Well, you keep adding people, there are more plates up in the air as to what you're saying and what you're promising. So is there a juncture, and now we're talking specifically relative to a high-tech startup, MedTech, is that you as the founder or CEO, you're putting your heart and soul into this, and you have control of the ownership. How much of it is bringing people on slowly, part-time, nurturing them in, or is it one of you have your business plan written and you're saying, if I can get to a certain point, and that's part of the funding question, I'm going to go out and hire so-and-so here because he's going to be our chief science officer. Those are the things that I think a lot of the first-time entrepreneurs have, is understanding the horizon that they're trying to navigate to, but get the buy-in from people. So where was that with you? You were working with people part-time and assuring them that if the funding came, they would flip to full-time and then maybe potentially flip to some equity?
Yep, exactly. And so basically, if you think about it, I just try to think of specific examples. One was, we just said, look, once the grant comes in, then we can hire you full-time. Or once we close our funding round, then we can bring you on full-time. And then we basically talked about the equity component at the same time when we brought them on, right? And that's definitely a negotiation, and everybody has different expectations, and certainly some of them are unrealistic. If you think about what it takes to start a business, and then somebody comes on several years later that doesn't necessarily have to take on risk to do that, and they're getting a salary right away, and they expect to get a big chunk of equity. You have to balance it with the people that have been there for a while and have taken risk, right? And trying to strike that right balance to make sure that you're taking all those factors into consideration and have some level of fairness. That is really important. And it's important to me because I want to be able to look myself in the mirror and say, my team is fairly incentivized, and certainly I want them to feel like they're part of the company, and the company is part theirs, and when we have an exit, that they all benefit from it, and that it's life-changing for them, right? That's my hope, and that's my desire, and certainly I want to make it a compelling outcome for everybody that's investing along the way. So anyway, those are some of the considerations, right, that you're trying to balance, and then everybody has a different perspective on it. So you have to listen to advice and then decide on what applies and what advice you're going to take and what you're not going to take.
Well, I imagine if the individual had the experience of a prior startup, it's a much easier conversation than trying to lure someone in who wants to be part of a startup but really doesn't have the data points of understanding of the trials and tribulations of building themselves into a startup situation.
Yeah, yes and no. I think in general, and I put myself back into the shoes when I joined a startup when I was not too early in my career. I was in my 30s, and my mindset was just, I want to get as much equity as I can.
Right.
And didn't really, think too much about what it took the company to get there. It was just more about, hey, I want to negotiate the best deal I can possibly negotiate. And then sometimes people just have completely unrealistic expectations, right? And whether or not they have been in startups. So it's just, you have to have a dialogue with them and make sure they understand that you can't correlate perceived value with percentage of of equity they're receiving, and also helping them understand, look, there's already 6 people or 5 people that are on the team that have a certain percentage of equity, right? And so that has to be balanced, right? And they took risk early on, while the person that's joining now has had a nice cushy salary and no risk. and so anyway, so it's just a balancing act, right? You want to make sure that whoever joins has that same sense of ownership and passion for the business, right? And regardless of whether they have 100 shares or whether they have 100,000 shares. It really, you want everybody to feel like they're part of the company and part of the mission, and that they're going to benefit when there's an exit.
Do you have any go-to person at this point? You're the CEO. You have bad days. You have bad situations. Is it? They always talk about having a mentor, but at some point, you're so knee deep in it. Are there people that can help you from the angel groups or from your prior relationships?
I think I'm really fortunate. So certainly our board is extremely helpful and supportive. So both Joya and Charles, I feel like I can go to any time. And in addition, my family is very supportive, so my wife has to listen to a lot. So sometimes my kids do too. They just kind of nod on the way to school. But I'm also fortunate because the company is part of a number of different ecosystems, whether it's Evo Nexus, whether it's MedTech Innovator, whether it's Cedars-Sinai Accelerator, whether it's part of cool companies. So I've been fortunate enough to build relationships with lots of other CEOs that are going through similar things, and so and I can reach out to them, and I talk about with other founders and other CEOs. I'm also part of a CEO circle where basically there's a group of CEOs that gets together every month, and so you put all these, I call it sort of a support network, if you will, that so I don't necessarily feel like all the pressure's on me or on our team. We have a wide sort of support group that helps us and helps make the company better, and so I feel grateful for that.
So as we wrap up, is there one piece of advice you would give to a first-time entrepreneur heading into MedTech?
Don't do hardware. There's a reason the word hardware isn't hard. Build a software company. I'm kidding a little bit, but yeah, I mean, if you're going to build a MedTech device company, just be prepared that there's going to be ups and downs. It's going to be a long journey, and make sure that you have the support system to help you along that journey. And that you personally have the resilience and the grit to see it through, because at the end of the day, it's not for the faint of heart. No startup is, but especially in the MedTech device space.
Well, Patrik, thanks so much for being a guest on Experienced Voices. I think there'll be a lot of listeners out there going through the startup process and would value some of your insights. So thank you again.
Well, thank you for having me. And yes, all the listeners, feel free to reach out to me on LinkedIn.
You have been listening to the podcast series Experienced Voices. To hear more and subscribe, visit AmericanEntrepreneurship.com/podcast, where you will also find a form for listener feedback.